How does a bullet get traced back to a gun after it's been used in a crime? Whether it's in TV shows or actual modern headlines, we've seen countless times investigators use forensic technology to pair a bullet to a murder weapon. What I've always been curious about is how exactly do they go about doing that? In modern times, like for example with the Luigi Mangione case, bullet casings were left behind. And while it's pretty obvious that you can use the bullet casing itself to determine what caliber and brand of bullet was used, I wanted to know what during their forensic analysis they were looking for exactly to determine how a bullet casing can be paired to a specific firearm that fired it. And before we get started, I want to make the disclaimer that I am not law enforcement, nor do I have any experience as a firearms instructor. Instead, I just wanted to explore this topic with y'all for the sake of fun. So there's actually a pretty famous case of bullet casings being paired alongside other evidence to identify the shooter and the firearm used in the murder, and that is actually the JFK assassination on November 22nd in 1963. After 3 shots were heard across the grassy knoll in Dallas, Texas that day, Lee Harvey Oswald was seen fleeing a window from the 6th floor of the school book depository, where investigators would later find 3 6.5mm casings and a nearby Italian Mannlicher Carcano 6.5mm rifle, which investigators would later use in tandem with a receipt found for the purchase of this rifle from a gun store to identify that rifle and Oswald as the killer in this slightly conspiratory case. So in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, they had eyewitness testimony, which put him at the scene of the crime. But what about in cases where investigators don't have eyewitness testimony or a suspect, and instead are just left with the bullet casings themselves? What can they use in their analysis to determine with certainty which specific firearm was used? When the trigger is pulled, the firing pin, as it strikes the primer, does so in a way that is consistent and unique somewhat to the firearm that is firing it, and so you can use that pattern with multiple test firings, if you are able to obtain the gun that is in question, and compare it to the bullet the bullet casing that was found at the scene of the crime. In addition to the firing pin making the indentation on the back of the primer, also there's breech faces and any sort of bolt or ejection mechanisms that can mar and scar the back of the cartridge. Now what if, for example, bullet casings aren't found, or they used a brass catcher, and the only thing that they have to use for analysis is the actual projectile itself? In many cases, investigators are able to recover the projectile used either from the victim or maybe the house or home surrounding the scene of the crime. And from the projectile, investigators are able to use microscopes and cameras to analyze the rifling pattern that was imparted on the projectile when it was fired. If later in the investigation they are able to get a hold of the supposed firearm in question, they can test fire a couple of rounds and then use the microscopes to compare the rifling. And as you know, rifling is pretty much unique to the rifle that is firing it, as it's almost impossible on a microscopic level to recreate the wear and tear and various nature of things that happens over the lifespan of a barrel. But that does beg the question, what of the event that they used a smoothbore weapon, such as a shotgun? Here I have a shotgun shell for a 12 gauge. This is a buckshot actually, but what if it was a slug? A slug looks just like this, just a bit bigger, and it would fit in a 12 gauge shotgun. But unlike in a rifle, which possesses rifling, the smoothbore is just going to shoot the slug out, and it's going to somewhat as it exits the barrel. And since the smoothbore lacks rifling to spin the bullet along the barrel, we won't be getting any consistent spiral marks along the bullet projectile to use as a comparator against other projectiles. So, theoretically, how could we find a consistent pattern? Let's take this for example. Let's say the shotgun that was used to shoot the slug was a homemade sawed-off shotgun that somebody took a hacksaw to in their backyard, and in the act of sawing off the end of the shotgun, they gouged a very unique pattern to the end of the muzzle. This, in theory, could provide investigators with a consistent method for identifying the shotgun used in the crime. And that's fine in theory, but what if we needed something that was a little bit more concrete? Recently, and as I say recently, in California as of 2007, there's been an effort to add microstamp etching to the end of firing pins used in handguns. And what this firing pin microstamp would do would etch the make, model, and serial number of the firearm onto the primer of the bullet casing every single time the trigger is pulled. And theoretically that does sound pretty great, but you can't consistently say that the primer is going to always be in the bullet casing after it's ejected and maybe stepped on, swept away. Those things fall out. The other thing is that manufacturers are having a hard time and pushing back a lot, because right now currently to get a firing pin, you can just order one off of the Glock store. It's $40 shipped to you, but you don't have to provide serial numbers or anything like that. You can just order it straight to you. In the event that microstamping becomes a more widely adopted requirement, manufacturers are going to have to require your serial number just to send you a new firing pin. And on top of that, they have to build and manufacture all new means of equipment to facilitate the manufacturing of these unique firing pins. But that's more for the manufacturer to worry about. I'm just worried as the consumer having to provide more forms just for simple parts. But that about wraps it up. Of course, everything that was discussed here is subject to various limitations when it comes to the actual application. And not in every case is the murder weapon suspect or sometimes even the projectile available to investigators to use for analysis. But this was a fun little thought experiment, and if you'd like to see more, please subscribe.